Greetings to all our viewers watching the channel. January 16th, 2026 would not be remembered by Canadians through the familiar images of power. No thunderous applause, no flags filling public squares, no pre-written speeches ready for media quotes. It began with something unmistakably Canadian. A pause. A long silence in Parliament, where members understood they were about to put a final period on a story that had followed the country for more than a decade. And within that silence, a historic decision was born. For many years, Canadians had been led to believe the choice was already made. That to defend the airspace stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from crowded cities to the frozen Arctic, Canada had no option but to join the F-35 club. $19 billion, 88 stealth fighters, promises of a new generation of warfare, all presented as an inevitability of the age, as the price of continuing to be seen as a serious ally. But behind that glossy picture, a growing feeling took hold within the military, the sense of being asked to believe rather than allowed to verify. The technical terms sounded impressive: sensor fusion, stealth dominance, allied interoperability, but they drifted farther and farther from the simple questions pilots and technicians asked every day. Could the aircraft take off on time? Would it operate reliably in the cold Canada considers normal? And if the answers were uncertain, who would be held accountable? The decision to cancel the F-35 deal, therefore, did not erupt like a rebellion. It felt more like a slow awakening, quiet but irreversible. A declaration that being an ally does not mean surrendering independent judgment, that sovereignty cannot be built on assumptions written for a different environment, a different doctrine, a different geography. When Canada said no, it was not only speaking to a contractor or a weapons program, it was speaking to its own long-held fear, the fear of being seen as an outsider if it failed to follow the momentum of the great powers. And from that moment, the story began to change its tone. It was no longer an abstract tale of budgets or distant geopolitics, but one that steadily returned to things that were concrete, cold, and real. Because to understand why Canada dared to make that decision, it is not enough to look at closed-door meetings in Ottawa or strategic analyses on paper. One must travel farther north to a place where every glossy theory faces its harshest test, where metal contracts, oil thickens, and there is no room for promises that cannot withstand the cold. It is there, in the frozen north, that the answer begins to emerge. The cold in Alaska is nothing like the kind of cold people usually imagine on winter postcards. It isn't romantic, it isn't quiet, and it is anything but forgiving. It is a cold that crushes everything it touches, turning metal brittle like glass and making every technical action a test of experience and discipline. For Canadians, this is not an exotic environment to study. It is a familiar reality, repeated month after month each year. And it was precisely in that setting that a test, seemingly routine, became an unexpected turning point. The scenario itself was unremarkable: an emergency interception drill simulating a threat entering airspace from the north. For pilots who had flown the CF-18 for years, this was almost a reflexive exercise. They knew exactly what to do, and they understood how every passing second mattered in an air defense mission. When the alarm sounded, no one imagined that the greatest tension would not be in the sky, but right there on the ground. The F-35 sat motionless on the runway, coated in a thin layer of frost. The start button was pressed, procedures followed exactly by the book. But instead of the familiar roar of an engine, there was only prolonged silence. At first, it was a few dozen seconds, enough to raise eyebrows. Then minutes passed, and that silence began to take on a different meaning. Technicians were called in, support equipment rolled out, and measures never meant for an urgent operational scenario were applied like improvised firefighting reflexes. 23 minutes. In that span of time, had this been a real situation, every concept of interception would have become meaningless. The hypothetical adversary would have arrived, completed its mission, and departed long ago. On paper, the F-35 is a symbol of fifth-generation superiority. On an ice-covered runway, it became a machine that needed to be woken up by manual intervention. That contrast required no commentary. It spoke for itself. The days of testing that followed offered little reassurance. Startup times improved, but they still fell outside every standard demanded by real-world air defense missions. Meanwhile, the aging CF-18s, often dismissed as obsolete in presentation slides, continued to do the one thing that mattered most: respond on time. No one denied their age, but in the northern cold, reliability sometimes outweighs every dazzling feature. When the F-35 finally did take off, doubts had barely settled before another layer of problems emerged. The sensor fusion system, the heart of the entire design philosophy, began to show troubling signs. Data became inconsistent, targets overlapped, and target locking slowed, then became impossible. Inside the cockpit, pilots were forced to spend precious time sorting out what information could be trusted and what was mere noise, a luxury that does not exist in modern air combat. Eventually, the cause was traced back to lines of code and seemingly harmless parameters. The system had been optimized for a temperature range that did not reflect Arctic reality. On a design table, that may have been just a technical assumption. In the field, it became the line between combat readiness and failure. Canada's nature does not change to suit aircraft, and in that quiet confrontation, it was not the ice that stepped back. What troubled many within the military was not only the technical malfunctions. It was the sense that what they were witnessing had never been fully disclosed from the start, that these limitations were not entirely unknown to the manufacturer, yet appeared as a surprise to the operators. As internal reports were written and technical notes sent up the chain, a question began to form. Small at first, then growing steadily larger. Was this merely a testing issue or a sign of a truth that had been concealed? That very question opened another door. No longer just a story of ice, engines, or individual sensors, but a story about information, about what was known and what was left unsaid. And then from somewhere in the past, an old email was pulled into the light. An email powerful enough to turn scattered doubts into a moment of revelation, pushing the entire story into a completely different chapter. That email did not surface like an explosion. It was more like a fragment of ice drifting slowly across what had seemed like calm water. At first, it was mentioned only in quiet exchanges, among people long accustomed to the system's careful language. An old document sent back in 2020. Not a public report, not a briefing for lawmakers, but an internal email. One written in a level of bluntness rarely seen in multi-billion-dollar defense programs. Its contents were not sensational. There were no accusations, no dramatic warnings, just cold, technical lines, each carrying the weight of fact. It laid out the F-35's limitations in extreme low temperatures, engine startup times extending beyond operational thresholds, degradation of the stealth coating's durability, and, most critically, the stability of the sensor system during prolonged operations in icy conditions. More importantly, the email stressed that these were not theoretical concerns. They had already been observed during testing. Then came the line that changed everything. The sender noted that these limitations needed to be fully and clearly communicated to Canada before any procurement decision was finalized. Not to cancel the contract, not to apply pressure, but so that Canada would understand exactly what it was buying and what trade-offs came with it. That did not happen. When the first readers revisited the email in the context of the Alaska tests, the dominant feeling was not anger, but a chill down the spine. What they had just witnessed on the runway was no longer an unexpected incident. It matched, with unsettling precision, warnings that had been written years earlier. The question was no longer whether the F-35 had problems, but why Canada had entered the contract as a buyer without being given the full picture. In earlier official briefings, the story had sounded entirely different. Canada was told about operations in Northern Europe, about experience from Scandinavian countries, about a platform that had been proven in cold environments. Those comparisons sounded reasonable, but they masked fundamental differences. The sheer scale of airspace to be defended, the dispersion of bases, the continuous exposure to extreme cold, and the near-instant response demands of North American air defense missions. The Patterson email, set alongside the polished presentation slides, created a contrast that was hard to accept. On one side was marketing language refined to persuade. On the other was technical language written for people who understood that a single omitted detail could lead to strategic consequences. In that moment, For many Canadian officers and officials, this was no longer a technical issue. It became a matter of ethics and responsibility. The greatest shock was not that a complex weapons program had limitations. In the defense world, that is almost a given. The shock lay in the fact that life-critical limitations had not been placed on the table transparently in a deal directly tied to national security and human lives. For a country that builds its identity on the rule of law and institutional trust, that was a serious fracture. From the moment the email came to light, the tone of discussion shifted noticeably. Ambiguous language lost its footing. Arguments that upgrades will fix it later began to sound hollow. Every upgrade has a cost, and the question became increasingly clear: why should Canada have to pay extra to obtain capabilities it had been promised from the beginning? Once exposed, the truth refused to stay tucked away in a drawer. It spread beyond technical meeting rooms and into the political arena, where every decision must answer to the public. Canada's leaders were no longer facing a procurement problem, but a matter of principle. Press forward, accept correction through money and silence, or stop and face the political consequences of admitting that the country had not been told the whole truth. And it was at that boundary, with all the facts finally on the table, that the question ceased to be, should the contract be canceled, and became, does Canada dare to say no? From an old, seemingly anonymous email, an unavoidable political decision was taking shape, one that would lead the country into the most difficult yet clearest moment of its national autonomy. When the truth was finally laid fully on the table, there was no longer any room for vague answers. Technical reports, flight logs, and internal emails were no longer scattered fragments, but pieces of a complete picture, one that forced Canada's leadership to look at it head-on. This was no longer the story of a troubled weapons program, but of how a national decision had been guided by assumptions that lacked transparency. The pressure at that moment did not come from just one direction. From the outside came steady reminders about alliance obligations, about strategic continuity, and credibility within NATO, not always voiced publicly, but always present. From within came the weight of political inertia itself. Years of lobbying, years of commitments already made, careers and positions tied to the F-35 program continuing forward. Canceling the contract did not simply mean changing plans. It meant acknowledging that a long road had been built on an unstable foundation. In closed-door meetings, the core question gradually came into focus. No one was arguing that the F-35 was not an advanced platform. The issue was whether it was the right platform for Canada, and more importantly, whether Canada could accept spending billions more to adapt an aircraft to conditions it should have been able to meet from the very beginning. When proposals surfaced to increase the budget to address Arctic-related issues, they ceased to be technical solutions. They became an implicit admission that the original promises had not been sufficient. That was the moment the turning point emerged. Because the message behind that request was unmistakable. Canada was being asked to pay extra to buy back confidence in a system that had already given them reason to doubt. For a country that places great weight on public accountability, that was difficult to accept, not because of the cost, but because of the principle. The decision to say no took shape in a heavy atmosphere, without celebration or any sense of victory. It felt like a mature decision, reached only after every easy option had been stripped away. Canceling the F-35 contract meant Canada would face diplomatic turbulence, difficult questions from allies, and skepticism even within its own institutions. But at the same time, it marked a reaffirmation of something fundamental. National security cannot be built on incomplete promises. The silence that followed the decision spoke volumes. There were no fierce counterarguments, no new evidence capable of overturning the case. Once the facts were compelling enough, debate became unnecessary. Canada chose to place its own realities above global political momentum and to accept the cost of independent thinking. Yet saying no was only half the story. A void immediately appeared. What would Canada do next? Cancellation without an alternative was not an option, because the northern skies do not wait for prolonged debates. And within that void, strategic thinking began to shift in a different direction. Less glamorous, but far more grounded in reality. Planners were no longer searching for a symbol of global power, but for a tool that could survive and fight in harsh conditions with limited resources and in scenarios of isolation. A platform born not to showcase expeditionary strength, but to endure, adapt, and respond quickly in prolonged cold environments. From there, one name began to surface more and more often, not as a compromise, but as a logical answer for the North. And as Canada began to view the world through the lens of its own geography and doctrine, the path toward the Gripen E slowly came into view, quietly but clearly, like a conclusion that had been waiting all along. Gripen E entered Canada's story not as a loud challenger, but as a reasonable whisper in a room already filled with too many loud voices. It carried none of the glow of global expeditionary campaigns, nor was it wrapped in slogans about dominance or absolute superiority. What Gripen brought instead was a different philosophy, quieter but far more grounded in reality. The philosophy of nations that live on the edge of harsh climates where every technical decision must first answer the question of survival before speaking of power. That philosophy was forged in Northern Europe, where vast spaces, sparse populations, and brutal weather force air forces to think differently. There are not always large bases, deep technical teams, or dense logistical chains. Aircraft must take off from short runways, sometimes nothing more than reinforced stretches of highway. Maintenance has to be fast and efficient, carried out by minimal personnel. And above all, the aircraft must be ready when called, whether it is dark, the winds are fierce, or temperatures drop so low that even metal behaves differently. When Gripen E is placed in the Canadian context, the parallels appear almost naturally. Bases spread across remote regions, interception missions that allow no delay, and an environment where normal is already extreme. Gripen was not designed to rely on a massive ecosystem constantly standing behind it. It was designed to operate when everything else has been stripped down. That is precisely what made many Canadian pilots and technicians feel a sense of familiarity, even reassurance in a way glossy specifications never had. More important still is the question of control. With Gripen, Canada would not simply be buying an aircraft, but the ability to understand it and master it. Access to software, the ability to integrate domestic sensors, and the freedom to develop solutions tailored to Arctic conditions opened an entirely different path compared to a model of deep dependency. In an era where electronic warfare and the information domain increasingly shape outcomes, not being locked inside technological black boxes becomes a genuine strategic advantage. Gripen E also does not promise perfection. But unlike earlier assurances, its limitations are placed on the table from the outset as part of a transparent exchange. There are no illusions of all-encompassing power, only a balance between capability, cost, and operating conditions. For Canada, after the shock of the F-35 experience, this approach was not merely more acceptable. It was necessary to restore trust in the defense decision-making process. That choice, therefore, is symbolic in its own distinct way. It is not flashy, nor does it openly challenge anyone. But it shows that Canada has returned to a fundamental question. What does it actually need to protect its own skies, rather than to fit an image others expect? Gripen E became the embodiment of a northern logic, practical, restrained, and anchored in natural conditions rather than political ambition. Yet even as that decision began to take shape, its impact quickly extended beyond technical considerations or military doctrine. Because when a country like Canada, long seen as a stable pillar of the Western alliance system, chooses this path, the message is not directed only at arms manufacturers. It echoes toward other capitals where similar questions are being asked quietly. In this story, Gripen E is not merely the answer to Canada's problem. It becomes the starting point of a broader shift in global security thinking. And it is right here, as this seemingly internal decision begins to send ripples beyond national borders, that Canada realizes it is not just choosing an aircraft. It is, inadvertently, changing the game, opening a new chapter of geopolitical consequences that the world cannot ignore. Canada's decision did not close the story. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that even Ottawa itself could not fully control. In geopolitics, there are actions that need no loud declarations to alter the atmosphere. A long-standing ally, one seen as stable and cautious, publicly withdrawing from the West's largest weapons program created a quiet but profound disturbance. In European capitals, where many governments are struggling with rising costs and increasingly visible technological dependence, Canada's move was watched with particular attention. Not everyone was ready to say it aloud, but a question began to echo in closed meetings. If Canada dared to do this, do we really have no other options? Once planted, doubt is not easily erased by press releases or diplomatic reassurances. In Washington, the initial reaction was restrained. There was no public confrontation, no sharp criticism, yet that very silence spoke volumes. Canada had not broken with the alliance, but it had shaken a long-held assumption that allies would accept any conditions as long as they were packaged under the label of collective security. Once that assumption was challenged, the space for future negotiation shifted as well. For NATO, the issue was even more complex. The alliance is built on coordination and standardization, but it also rests on trust that each member understands its own core interests. Canada's decision forced NATO to confront an uncomfortable reality. Unity cannot be sustained through pressure or inertia, but must be grounded in genuine alignment between doctrine and national conditions. A strong alliance is not one where everyone buys the same thing, but one where each member can contribute most effectively in its own way. At a deeper level, the geopolitical impact of this decision lay in how it redefined the concept of loyalty. Canada did not abandon the West, nor did it pivot toward another power bloc. It did something simpler and harder. It asked a question. In today's world, where many nations are trapped between security pressures and economic constraints, the act of questioning itself carries a liberating meaning. Global arms manufacturers could not ignore the message either. Canada's signal was clear. The era of selling vague promises to countries with unique operating conditions is drawing to a close. Transparency is no longer a formal courtesy. It is becoming a prerequisite for long-term credibility. When a customer is willing to say no despite the political cost, the balance of power in defense deals begins to shift. For middle powers, Canada's story brings both comfort and challenge. Comfort because it shows they are not alone in their doubts. Challenge because it raises a harder question. Do they have the resolve to act on their true interests, or will they continue to hide behind safe decisions that grow more expensive over time? Canada did not offer a universal formula, but it did set a precedent, and perhaps the deepest consequence lies elsewhere. When a country chooses pragmatism over symbolism, transparency over spectacle, it sends a signal about how security should be approached in the 21st century. Not by chasing pre-designed images of power, but by building capabilities aligned with one's own geographic, social, and political realities. In a world that is becoming ever more fragmented, that message resonates as a reminder. Sovereignty is not something granted by alliances. It is something preserved through clear-eyed decisions, even when those decisions change the game. When all the layers of analysis are finally closed, when the technical, political, and geopolitical debates gradually fade, what lingers in this story is not the name of an aircraft. It is a simple yet heavy question that Canada was forced to answer for itself. What truly measures sovereignty? Not the slogans repeated at conferences, nor the act of standing in a particular formation or buying the same weapons as someone else. Sovereignty in that moment was measured by the ability to say no when every pressure was pushing toward yes. Canada did not choose the easy path. It accepted the discomfort of its allies, the skeptical questions of international observers, and even the harsh scrutiny of its own citizens. Yet in that choice, something deeply Canadian became clear. Calmness, pragmatism, and an unwillingness to tolerate false assumptions. They did not reject the value of alliances, but they refused to trade their geographic reality and survival conditions for a symbolic sense of security. The story of the F-35 and the Gripen E, therefore, is not about winning or losing. It is a story of maturity. A mid-sized nation coming to terms with the fact that not every global solution is right for it, that the most advanced technology is meaningless if it does not work when it is needed, and that loyalty, if not paired with independent judgment, will sooner or later turn into dependence. In today's world, where nations are increasingly drawn into dense webs of alignment, Canada's decision carries meaning far beyond its borders. It reminds us that security is not a packaged product to be purchased, but an ongoing process of choice, sometimes painful but necessary. It also shows that sovereignty is not defended by words, but by concrete decisions made at the right moment, even when those decisions make others uncomfortable. And perhaps the most valuable outcome of this story lies not in the future of the Canadian Air Force, but in the precedent Canada has set. A precedent that saying no is not an act of defiance, but an act of responsibility. That respecting allies does not mean surrendering the right to self-determination. And that sometimes to stand firm in a world full of pressure, the hardest thing of all is remaining honest with oneself. If you have a different perspective, if you agree or disagree with Canada's choice, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your viewpoint is an important part of this discussion. And if you find analyses like this valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring and unpacking the geopolitical stories quietly shaping the world around us.